The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
And hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm your host, Charles Christian, and over the next hour we'll be delving into the world of the weird, witchcraft, ghosts, supernatural, paranormal, that kind of stuff. Anyway, we've got a big interview, very pleased to have, which is all about haunted history. Ghostly encounters from around the ancient world. So some really old ghost stories of the types that we don't normally hear so much about these days. However, before we go any further, here's Janie, who's got a story about a witch cemetery in Illinois. Over to Janie.
Well, yes, it's the St. Omer Cemetery witch grave. Okay, it's in Illinois, obviously America, and it is an actual place. And it's in an actual town, or should I say it's a sort of ghost town, but in the other sense of the word, called St. Omer. And so there you go, driving along your country roads in Illinois, you'll find a gravel road. There is actually, you can look it up and you'll get a sort of GPS listing for it. So you might want to check it out. It leads you, this gravel road, to the town of St. Omer, but of course there's nothing much there left. They all moved out and moved away or died or whatever a long time ago. But there is its cemetery there. And there's a strange monument there. Mm-hmm. Called the Barnes Monument, which is the subject of a local witch legend. Oh. You see where I'm going with this? Right. So this gravestone is called the Barnes gravestone. It's quite well known and does get quite a few visitors. But there's a big question mark over it. Not just in my mind, in many others. Okay, the gravestone takes the form of a ball atop a pyre. Yeah.
As in a pile of logs?
Yeah, that sort of pyre. Mm-hmm. The other strange thing about the grave is, in the cemetery, it's oriented facing north. So it's oriented north to south instead of, obviously, east to west. Which is the second clue. Mm-hmm. 4 people are buried there. There's a Marcus Barnes. There's his parents, Granville and Sarah, and his wife, Caroline, whose stated date of death could never have happened.
Tell me why.
Well, because it's February the 31st, 1882, which does sort of coincide with when they were last doing trials and doing away with witches. 1878 was the last, no, wasn't it? Salem witch trials?
200 years.
200 years before. Fairly close then. Yeah, okay. Some of my history can be a little bit shaky, but anyway. So the prevailing law about this, as in
L-O-R-E,
is that Caroline Barnes was indeed a witch. At least anyway, she was accused of being one. And she was hanged, but also, depending on who you ask, burned or buried alive for her magical crimes. So the sphere atop of her tombstone represents a crystal ball, and it's said to glow on moonless nights. So it might be that impossible date of February the 31st, which of course can't happen, is actually a preventative measure. Because the witch, you see, would rise again on her death date, but if her death date never came, she wouldn't reappear. So, neat, clever. Anyway, people also claim that film photographs of the Barneses' grave won't develop, but digital ones seem to work just okay. It's quite handy. But there's also a claim that secret rituals are carried out there in the dead of night. Because there has been some evidence that the ball has been repeatedly found with melted white candle wax dried atop it.
And indeed, if you look on the Atlas Obscura website, their photographs show quite clearly stump of a candle on the top.
Yeah. Well, that didn't get there by chance, dropped by a seagull, did it?
Exactly.
There's something going on there. Actually, though, in reality, there are very few facts to back up accusations of witchery. Again, local law seems to have sprung out of the weird anomalies surrounding the tombstone, but there is a tragic history surrounding the Barnes family, as there often is. So Marcus Barnes, he was a father, wasn't he? He died in a sawmill accident in 1881 and was buried with his parents. Just 2 months later, Caroline would die of pneumonia at the age of 23. Her actual death date was either the 26th or the 28th, apparently. And so February 31st may have just been a typo, too expensive to fix. And then, of course, these were the last of the Barneses, and so there was nobody to sort the error out. So that could have been that, as opposed to something, super clever to stop witches coming back. But actually, there was nobody left in town at that point. They only ever had, St Omer only ever had about 40 to 50 families, a little old post office, blacksmith's, general store. And by the time the Barnes family had died off, the town had done the same. And so all that remains is St Omer Cemetery. And it's worth going to, though, apparently, because, there's many other old grave markers that are worth looking at. And, yes, it's really the history of Caroline Barnes and this possible fact that she was a witch that has kept the whole thing alive, so to speak. But there you go. Yes, you can search for it, GPS, under St Omer Witch Cemetery. So you can find it. And people do. They often leave coins on top of the sphere. Not sure why. But I suppose,
That's going back to putting pennies over the eyes of dead people
could be,
to...
Yeah. Anyway, so take your pennies, take your candle, take your digital camera, and see what you can find. Good luck. Let us know what happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Janie. And now, as promised, our big interview. And we're talking to Leslie Fleur, who is the art director for the Ancient Origins magazine and creative manager for the Ancient Origins website, who are some very nice people who I write for on a fairly regular basis. And as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to be talking about ghostly encounters around the ancient world. So, Liz, you recently put together an article for the Ancient Origins magazine on haunted history, ghostly encounters around the ancient world. Now, it's particularly intriguing because we all tend to know about, certainly in the UK, our own ghosts there, and obviously we read about them in North America, but we tend to forget that ghosts have been a feature of the ancient world all around the world. What made you research the idea? What was the sort of driving force behind it?
Oh, well, thanks for having me on. I would say it was twofold. One, I've always been interested in ghosts and the afterlife and funerary rites and everything in relation to that. But also it was coming up on Halloween, and so we were doing an Halloween issue. And it just sort of came together like that. But we cover at Ancient Origins, obviously, Ancient Origins. So we want to make sure that people knew where this all had come from. Originally, we all understand, ghosts and ghost hunting and all that excitement today, but it does stem back to the ancient times.
Yeah. And, I mean, it's across all cultures as well. I mean, it's not just Western cultures, but everywhere, isn't it?
That's right. Absolutely. Everyone has their own unique rituals and ghost stories and ways of dealing with ghosts. But you'll find as time goes on, as we get closer to modern times, a lot of this seems to coalesce. So we end up doing the same things and tackling ghosts in the same way. I don't know whether that was through communication or whether it was found that, that must work. Let's continue doing that. And it caught on everywhere. But so.
Yeah. And in the more ancient ghost tales, are there any particular common themes that come through? I mean, you often hear that ghosts are there to, live out some cataclysmic event in their life, or to try and pass on a warning to future generations, or, looking for something.
I would say so.
Yeah?
Yes, I would say so. There are definite themes that stand out. Generally, it's if you died prematurely, you were going to have a bad time. Or if you died as a result of murder, you'd probably come back. And, childbirth, death in childbirth was a major part of global belief systems. And that was someone who would definitely return in grief. Ghosts would return throughout systems because they needed to finish something in their life. Mm-hmm. And this was one way to do it, I suppose, whether that was by possessing or making someone else do what they wanted. Normally, this would be done through rites. So if you had a ghost that came back for various reasons, that would trouble the living so much that they would be like, okay, we need to do these proper things to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
That's neat. Yes, I can see that.
Veneration of the dead or ancestor worship also was central to these things. So ghosts and hauntings weren't always negative. As you know, if we start exploring the different locations in the ancient world, it wasn't always a bad thing to be visited by a ghost. It probably wasn't pleasant, but in some ways, if you get a visit from your uncle, that's one thing. But once he's dead, maybe you're not so keen on seeing him.
Yes, yeah. Do any particular cultures have more, malevolent ghosts or friendly ghosts? Is there a sort of a cultural difference? I mean, you watch the sort of Chinese movies, and there seem to be an awful lot of vengeful ghosts featuring them. Obviously, that's fiction, but they seem to have a bit of a trend for vengeful ghosts.
No, that's true.
Oh, right.
That's true. Well, I mean, in a way, I wouldn't say that. In fact, if we're talking about ancient China, that again leads me down to the ancestor worship, because that played a powerful role, and there were good and bad ghosts in almost all ancient cultures. So now the ancestor spirits would send powerful warnings or important info, through dreams. Mm-hmm. This was not considered even a haunting. That was assistance.
Right.
So, but outside of that, ghosts were considered malevolent or harmful. I think in many movies, they feature a young, beautiful girl with long black hair who is haunting people, and she's bad. Yes. She would suddenly transform into a hideous creature. But that is an ancient story from ancient times. That's not a new thing just in movies. The interesting, there's a way with each ghost, there's ways to banish them.
Right.
So, in particular for ancient China, ghosts could only be seen by candlelight. And they walked because they were wronged in life and out to get revenge. But they also would have a ghost festival, and it was
Right.
held on the 15th day of the 7th month of the Chinese year. So it's like Samhain
Yes.
for the Celtic world,
Yeah.
when the veil between the worlds is thinnest.
Yeah.
So, like many other cultures, they'd have special meals and they'd burn paper money. And this would honor and appease the gods, and it would ensure good luck. And the ancestors are happy, and the people are happy. So that's all good. And then the final thing would be that paper boats and paper lanterns would be released into the water,
Yeah.
so that the souls would be guided to their final destination.
Right.
But you're right. You're correct about the sentiment of the evil ghosts, because China in particular had a ghost hunter, which I can't say that I've found too many of in other cultures. But the ghost hunter Zong Kui would scare away ghosts with his fierce scowl and his magical sword. So that's one way of doing it.
Yes, I'll have to remember that. Just scowl at them.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
And
But
yeah, sorry, go on.
oh, I was going to say that reminded me of the ancient Romans. As far away as China was from Rome, there are connections, because the ancient Romans also could only see ghosts by torchlight, which is interesting. Light was necessary to see ghosts, which isn't a thing I don't think that we normally think of today. Normally, we fear ghosts when it's dark out.
Yes.
Normally.
Yes.
So that's interesting that the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese would need light to see them. But again, in the classical world, the ghost would visit through dreams, similar. That is a common theme. And it wasn't a sign of a restless ghost either. It was just ancestors communicating. So
Right.
the solution for that, again, was ritual mourning and festivals, food and drink and offerings. But the funny thing about the Greeks and the Greek world is that they would have these rituals, but publicly it would be an annual thing. And they're like, here's your day, ghosts. Now get out of here and come back next year. We'll do this again.
Right. Yeah. Just going back to the Chinese ghost, you said it was on the 15th day of the 7th month of the Chinese year. When's that translated over to?
Oh my gosh.
Because
I believe it's later in the year.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Right.
But I would have thought immediately, oh, that's July, but no.
Yeah. Switching over from China to the Americas, we've all heard of the Mexican Day of the Dead, but what other traditions do the Americas have, or you were able to find in your research?
Right. For the Mesoamericans, the ancient Mesoamericans, the afterlife was a dark and horrible place. There was a sort of heaven and a sort of hell, but the lords of the dead were many, and it wasn't just one guy. There was a few, and they would trick and delay the souls on its way to paradise. That was their one job, I guess, thwarting souls. So some souls would lose their way, and they'd have to return to Earth. And this is where this was clearly unnatural for the people, and so they would have day keepers or shaman who would be needed, and they would use amulets or charms to ward off the ghosts. But the interesting thing I find about ancient Mesoamerica belief systems is that I haven't seen another culture where the Maya felt that ghosts returned as plants. So lovely, nice smelling plants were for people who were good in life. And for people who were less good or evil or did something wrong in life, they would return as poisonous or ugly plants or even sharp cacti. So that was that's an interesting take. I quite like it.
Yeah, that's neat. That yes.
Yeah.
Oh, very good.
But proper burials and the correct rites would stop the ghosts.
Yeah.
Similarly to most ancient cultures. So, but if a body of a ghost was located, it was thought that then a ghost dog or a spirit dog would guide the soul to the afterlife. So that's an interesting take on it. And of course, you mentioned the fact that the dead ancestors were celebrated rather than mourned, which is where, we have the Day of the Dead, which is exciting and colorful. And Day of the Dead celebrations are happy. No, they're not sad. And people go out to the graveyards and celebrate among the cemeteries and the graves of their ancestors. But not everyone, who comes back are wonderful, benevolent ancestors, because again, returning to the women who died in childbirth idea, they got named Kiwateteo, and these were dangerous women who would wait at crossroads, but not to tempt men like they would do in other cultures, but they waited at the crossroads to attack women with children, and they would take the children or steal children away from houses at night. Which is an interesting aspect. I think actually there's a movie that is coming out recently that's called La Llorona, and it's on this theme itself about, a woman who has died prematurely and she wants children. She wants to attack and take away the children.
No, right. So, moving on from Mesoamerica, in the article, you also talk about ghost traditions in Africa, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the ancient, what we in the West call cradle of civilizations, and also India. What sort of features did you find there? Because I seem to recall that the Mesopotamians again are a bit prone to evil demons, aren't they? In there.
Yes, absolutely. You're correct. They do have evil demons, and they do pop up in modern culture, modern popular culture. I believe it was a Mesopotamian demon in the Exorcist movies.
Yes, it was. Yes,
the whole crux of the problem there.
Yes,
but. The interesting thing is when a person died in ancient Mesopotamia, they could take it with them. They say you can't take it with you. Well, they could, because they took all of their personality traits. They took all the memories of their lives. That would all stay intact as they traveled to the underworld. They'd go to the underworld, which was called Irkala, and it was ruled by a goddess, Aresh Kigal, and her consort. And there you would become a gidim or an etimu as a ghost. Yeah. And you would meet with the court of the afterworld with the famous Anunnaki, and they would decide your fate. Right. So it wasn't, the afterlife wasn't such a bad place, even though there were beasts and demons.
Right.
You would, as a ghost, you would get your own afterlife house. Yes. You'd get to see your own old friends and family. And you'd even get a sort of a get out of jail free card, because you're allowed to return to the land of the living if you have unfinished business. But if you haunted the living without permission from Shamash, the sun god, you would have a problem. That was his job, to make sure that you got punished for that. But he also, on the other hand, might he was benevolent also, because he might dole out funerary offerings to forgotten ghosts. But there were several ways you could be sure you saw, as a living person, you saw or heard a Mesopotamian ghost. You'd be stricken by headaches, vision or hearing loss, dizziness, or mental disorders. Each god or ghost might cause a particular illness. So in order to cure these maladies, there were several very familiar ways, even in ancient Mesopotamia. There was exorcisms, especially, ritual burials, amulets or charms, potions, even suppositories that would stop you from seeing ghosts. So I don't know. Maybe they need to make a comeback. Make those ghost hunting shows very interesting.
Yes. It's interesting you're saying that there's a court that weighs you up, because that's obviously familiar with the sort of Christian concept, but the ancient Egyptians had that as well, didn't they? That they weighed your soul against a feather or something, and if you were found wanting, there was a demon crocodile or something that ate you.
Exactly. No, you've got it exactly right. I think people are most likely or most familiar with these traditions. Ancient Egyptian culture has been hugely impactful. We've highlighted in our popular Western culture since Egyptomania of the 1800s.
Yes.
And so I think people are familiar with that. They're famous for, the ancient Egyptians are famous for taking great pains to prepare the body for the afterlife.
Yes.
They'd have the elaborate preservation techniques and rituals. So what was going on there was the soul or the ba of a person would need to recognize the body, and they could do that by preserving it really well. So then the ba would reunite after death, and then together the body and the soul would make its way to the underworld. And the underworld was called Duat. And once you got there, the soul would be judged by Osiris, who was the god of life and death and resurrection. And they had a lot of cool names for everything that they were doing down there, because they have the Hall of Truth. You'd go to the Hall of Truth, and you'd have your weighing of the heart ceremony on the scales of justice. And that's where the heart of the dead person would be weighed against the feather on the scales. And the heart wasn't removed from a mummy. They'd remove all the other organs, but the heart was left in the body of the dead.
Right.
That's your ib.
Right.
And so if the heart was lighter, the soul would continue the journey to sort of a heaven-like place called Aru. But if the heart was heavier, bad news. You're right, it would be devoured by Amit, who was part lion, part hippopotamus, and part crocodile. I think the ancient Egyptians were like, these are the baddies of the natural world. So that was Amit. And if Amit devoured your heart, you would no longer exist. And non-existence was considered the fate worse than death. So that was a hell in a way. But I found that it's interesting what might cause a heavy heart. In this court, you'd be given a chance to show what a good job you'd done on earth. You would recite your declaration of innocence, or it was called 42 negative confessions. So they included things like, you wouldn't say how good you did. You just said, I have not mistreated people. I did not blaspheme God. I did not impoverish the poor of their belongings. I did not kill or order killings. I did not steal milk from the mouths of small children, and I did not deprive cattle of its pasture, and so on and so on. So that was your declaration. And then, so if you made it through this test, you enjoyed an afterlife, much like on Earth, actually, with a house, a family. The houses and families in the afterworld are a common theme. But I don't know if there were bills or taxes to go with that. I don't know. But unfortunately, sacrificed slaves were found in royal tombs, and it's supposed that these would be, afterlife attendants or groupies to care for the royalty in the afterlife.
Yeah.
In tombs, they would find food and riches, statues, amulets of protection, books of instructions, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But there were, for the living, there were winning techniques for avoiding ghosts, like having the body properly prepared and properly buried, and with the correct rites. And you had to continually remember the person. But, if not, the ghost would walk the earth and cause nightmares, bring on feelings of guilt or illness. But interestingly, the mummy the concept of the mummy that we have, with the shuffling around and it's disgruntled with intruders, that's a modern idea. So it's a more modern idea. They didn't have that in ancient Egypt.
But they did have the idea that the dead body was to be preserved, didn't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Preserved for eternity.
So
that way,
yes. So all the
Yes.
Egyptologists who were digging up mummies and unwrapping them and doing all the things they were in the 19th century, they were unleashing unhappy spirits.
Yes, absolutely. As per their belief system, absolutely, they were causing some
As per
sort of
their belief system, I should
zombie
add.
apocalypse.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
otherwise
that's right.
you wouldn't be able to get around the British Museum in London for disgruntled ghosts of mummies running around the place.
Absolutely. Call Brendan Fraser or Tom
Yes.
Cruise. They're the mummy experts these days. So
Yeah, exactly.
get them in there.
Yes. Right. What about India? I mean, India,
Right.
we sort of have awareness of reincarnation and beliefs like that. How did that fit in with ghosts and things?
Oh, right. Well, they also had their own versions of ghosts. Again, similar to what we might think of today as ghosts. I know that they were dressed in white, and they would walk around on backwards feet, which was a symbol of humanity in an unnatural state. And they were called bhoots, Bhoots, boots.
Right.
And not just regular boots. They would possess the living so that they could carry on with their undead lives, walk around with a meat puppet.
Yes.
But they could also shapeshift into many forms. Telltale signs would be hovering. They didn't like to touch the ground. They also would cast no shadow. They spoke with a distinctive nasally voice, which seems a bit silly. I'm not sure if it's scary, but
Yes.
it apparently was.
Hello, I'm dead. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And another strange thing is they had an affinity for milk. They would seek it out and immerse themselves in it. So if you drank that boot-infested milk, you would be the new host for the ghost.
Right.
So, and that was a huge problem in ancient India. And they feel that they believe that's why cremation of bodies was practiced.
Right.
It's to get rid of this problem.
Right. Right.
They would ward off ghosts with the cremation of bodies. They'd add turmeric and tokens of protection. But again, coming back to there's a common theme of women dying in childbirth. They were called churail, and they would have backwards feet, but also upside down body parts, and kind of be a mishmash of body parts. And they would lure men in hopes of marrying them or killing them.
Right.
I imagine they've had more luck with killing them.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that would be right, yes.
But I mean, not always. If we return to China, there was, of course, the idea of corpse brides. So that the corpse brides in ancient China were a practice that actually carries on to this day. So it dates to about 200 BC. If someone dies unmarried, they can still get married after death. So a living person is assigned to the spirit so that the spirit can pass through the underworld with a legitimate spouse. This gave unmarried living women a husband. That was an important social requirement. It was also done to preserve family names and to appease restless, lonely ghosts. So that is a thing. That marrying is not so far-fetched. So...
Right.
Yeah.
No, I didn't realize that. Yeah. And I'm conscious of the time going on, but what about Africa? What do we have there?
Right. Yeah, it's hard to nail down because there's such a great mix of faiths and practices for ghosts across the continent.
Yeah.
Ghosts truly had a strong power over people. they were ancestors, but they were also kings or heroes, and they were remembered and honored like Christian saints are.
Yeah.
So there was, contrary to what we believe now, though, or contrary to many belief systems, it was felt that punishments and rewards were for this life, not the afterlife. So there's no heaven, no hell. But this belief in witchcraft and sorcery continues today. So people are burned or killed brutally in a body-destroying way so that their soul will not find its way to the afterlife, and thus it won't be with the ancestors, which is the African equivalent to hell. But moving on from Africa into the Middle East, it's fascinating that there's no such thing as ghosts in the Islamic faith. So I find that an interesting and modern take for ancient times, that there's no such thing. But funny, and supernatural beings certainly existed in their myths.
Yeah,
so
because they have the jinn, don't they? Or genie, as we
that's right.
know them.
Exactly. But they weren't really ghosts. They were supernatural creatures of free will, and they could be either good or bad, and they worked with humans or worked against them.
What in your researches was the most interesting findings?
Oh,
What did you think? I never realised that. That's weird. That's fascinating.
believe it or not, probably the medical cures for ghosts. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's also a bit tragic because, a lot of mental illnesses or true horrible ailments were, said to be the work of ghosts. And so the treatments sometimes could be worse than, the disease itself. But mental illness was often treated in a way so that exorcisms were mandatory to remove the ghost, or even in some instances trepanation, which is or trepanning, which is drilling a hole in the skull of the individual while alive, and then letting the evil spirits or ghosts out. So it's fascinating, but also unfortunate. Now we understand much more, medically, and we understand that mental illness isn't ghosts necessarily. It's unfortunate, but yeah, I found that interesting. And if only it could be cured by a suppository, but but no, an ancient Mesopotamian one at that.
Yeah. Just one final question. We did briefly touch on it. What about the Celtic view on ghosts?
Right. Well, in the article, we did cover the banshee of Celtic lore, who is a woman who died prematurely, and her horrible screams of grief portend death. There are a lot of creatures in supernatural creatures in that belief systems that would cross the line between the underworld and the fairy realms. So they weren't true ghosts, if you will. They were beings. But for ghosts in particular, the cyclical or wheel-like nature of the belief systems meant that you were more likely to have a visitation at certain times of the year, like this time of year.
Yeah.
Ghosts were thought to walk freely at Samhain, late October, early November. So here we are.
Yeah.
But, we're starting to see a theme here as they prepared feasts for the ghosts, which included slaughtering cattle and burning bones on a massive fire.
Yes.
The evil ghosts would be confused or thwarted if you wore a mask, and they would pass you by. This eventually led to the Halloween tradition of costumes and disguises. So that's kind of cool, and something that carried through to modern day.
Yeah.
But in the Scandinavian peoples, they had many specific rites and ceremonies. So in terms of ghosts, fallen warriors were a big danger because they might return as Draugr, or an undead creature, meaning again walker, who was much like a modern zombie. He had decomposing flesh, and he was out to attack those who had wronged it in life. I don't know if brains come into it, but, But there were steps to stopping a zombie or a drogger. When someone was buried, iron scissors were placed with the deceased, or twigs were tucked into the clothing. I'm not sure of the significance of the twigs, but iron was one ancient way to stop the supernatural.
Yes.
In this way, needles were sometimes pressed grossly into the soles of the feet, and toes were tied together to prevent them from walking, to trip up a zombie. And a special door was built so that a corpse door, so that corpses would be paraded through the door and back and forth and turned all around, so as to confuse the spirit, like playing pin the tail on the donkey type of thing. And then the door would be sealed up to prevent a return.
Right. So what, you'd make a hole in the side of your house to take the ghost out?
I think a small door was created outside.
Yeah.
And they would do the ritual through the door there.
Yeah.
And then it would be sealed.
Yeah.
And, put down.
Yes, because that's a bit like the thing about if you bury someone at a crossroads, when their spirit gets up again, they don't know which way to go, supposedly. Right. With suicides and witches and murderers and things, and the idea was that they would not know which direction to go and would just stand there looking confused until dawn. Then it was too late and they would disappear again. Yes.
Oh, so in that scenario, the light banishes the ghosts rather than brings it on.
Yeah, it stops them coming back to haunt you. You bury them sufficiently far away that even if they do come back from the dead, they'll never find you because they don't know which way to go. Which I suppose the moral of that is, don't bury a body with a phone with sat-nav on it, otherwise it would be able to find its way back to you.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. We have modern ways.
Yes. Take that iPhone off him. Yes. Take that.
We want that anyway.
Yes.
In many ways, the ancient world, I feel, is more prepared than today than we are for dealing with ghosts. But, a lot less tolerant about ghosts as well. We in modern times, the debate rages about their existence or not. But it's almost a bad sign. A ghost is never a comforting visitation. That's probably because the world around us has shaped how we see the afterlife and ghosts. We don't speak of receiving ancestor spirits as a comforting thing anymore. Not very often, anyway.
I think some of the sort of Wiccan type traditions still, and neo-pagan traditions still take that view, but they are harking back to earlier traditions rather than the rest. But yes, as you say, the return of Uncle Albert is not something that you look forward to these days.
No, not generally. No.
Yeah. Right. Well, I won't take up any more of your time. That's been brilliant, Liz. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thank you so much, Charles, for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Now, a couple of updates, amendments, corrections there from stories we've run earlier in today's show. First of all, we got into a little bit of a muddle when I was talking to Liz there about the Chinese New Year. Okay, the Chinese New Year for this year, 2019, took place on the 5th of February, and for next year, 2020, which is the year of the rat, tasty, is the 25th of January. And I was also talking to Janie about American witchcraft trials, and we made reference to the fact that the Salem trials were back in the 17th century. Let me just get my piece of paper. Yes, 1692, the famous, infamous Salem witch trials began. However, the last witch trial in America took part, wait for it, in 1878. And, curiously, it was in Salem again, or Salem. No, Salem. And sometimes it's called the Second Salem Witch Trial. And it involved a Lucretia L.S. Brown, who was an adherent of the Christian Science religion, and she accused fellow Christian scientist Daniel Spofford of attempting to harm her through his mesmeric mental powers. Basically, she was claiming that he tried to bewitch her. You'll not be surprised to hear the judge dismissed the case. So, witchcraft. Witchcraft trials took place in America a lot later than you think. And while we're on the subject of witchcraft trials, did you know there's a place in the Netherlands, in Holland, in the city of Udewater, which is near Utrecht, and it's famous for its weighing house, which includes a Hexenswaag, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, so apologies to any Dutch speakers, but it's known as the witch's scales. Now, back in the days of witchcraft, which in continental Europe was running from the 16th century into the 17th century, into the early 18th century, back in those days, there were a number of ways of testing to see if somebody was a witch. One was pricking them to see whether or not they would bleed. This was one of Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General's methods. The other was swimming them, where they would be thrown into water. And if they sank and drowned, typically, they were innocent. But if they floated on the top, which actually happens to most people, they were condemned as being witches. The theory being that because witches have no soul, having sold it to the devil, they are lighter than other people. Now, the Dutch, they took the view that an alternative way of doing this was to weigh people. And if people were weighed, and to use the phrase, their body weight was not in proportion to their build, in other words, they seemed a lot lighter than they really should be, then they must be witches because they'd sold their souls. The difficulty was most of the witch scales in other towns were corrupt. People were taking bribes and they were rigged so that innocent people would be revealed to be witches because somebody was putting the wrong weights on and whatever. Anyway, in Udenwater, as a result of intervention by who intervented it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it was one of the rulers of the time, and it was in the early 17th century, the 1600s, they built some imperial approved scales for measuring witches. And basically you stood on one platform, the accused witch, while the weigh-housed master would place the weights on the other side, which he thought were appropriate to a person of your body weight. And lo and behold, if it turned out that the weights rose in the air, or at least were balanced, then you weren't a witch. However, if on the other hand, the weights crashed down to the floor and you were floating around in the air, then clearly you were a witch. Now, as it happened, nobody who ever was weighed on the Udenwater scales was ever found to be a witch. And not only that, but they were given a certificate, an official certificate, which they could use in any other town. So if you're in your town and somebody's saying, she's a witch, burn her, you could scoot off to Udenwater, to the Hexenwaag, go on the scales and get a certificate and say, look, it's official. I'm not a witch. And very good business it was too. And the Way House is now a museum. And but you can still go in there, part of the tourist trade now, and go on the scales and get a certificate to confirm whether or not you're a witch. So, useful bit of information to know, should you be of the witchy persuasion. Over here in the UK, we're now at the end of the summer season when all the seaside resorts have their theatres open and putting on performances and shows for the holidaymakers. That season's now ending. And typically these days it's comedy, it's song and dance, it's comedians off the television, that sort of thing. You're familiar with it. However, 100 years ago, there was an entirely different type of seaside spectacle to go and visit. Yes, it was called fasting. You went and you paid good money to watch somebody in a box or a glass case sitting there not eating. This was regarded as good entertainment there. Up in Scarborough, which is actually my hometown, in 1907, a certain Riccardo Sacco was there, and he completed a 38-day fast. During this time, he lost 3.5 stones in weight, and kept alive only by water and consuming 1,500 cigarettes during this period. You've got to wonder quite what that does for the metabolism. And it wasn't just the men who did it. Moving down the coast to Great Yarmouth, where we are now, in 1907, a woman by the name of Mary Bushchart made a brief appearance. She was apparently 25 years old, and she was put in a glass case, and she spent 28 days there, and people would, she was there visible to the audience from 10 a.m. in the morning till 10:30 p.m. at night, and you paid 2 pence to go in there and see how she was progressing. And at the end of completing her 28-day fast on the 17th of August, she said that she felt weak but well, but she did long for some nutritious food, presumably slightly more nutritious than 1,500 cigarettes. As they say, they used to make their own entertainment in the old days. And here's another little odd story on whether regional dialects and accents are at all affected by magnetic variances in the Earth's magnetic field across different longitudes and latitudes, and that does this have some kind of effect on the inner ear, so that if you are up north, the pressure on your ear causes you to speak in one accent, whereas if you're in another part of the country where the magnetic field is different, the accents are also different. This does sound to me like rather dodgy science, because when you look at accents, certainly in the UK, and the US is similar, you can get quite pronounced changes of accent in a relatively short space of time. You know, it's probably more down to historical factors such as the original tribes who were originally settled there. In the case of America, the original settlers moving in there, rather than that. But I say I'm open for comment on that one, so you know where to find us if you have a view on whether or not the Earth's magnetic fields can cause the inner ear, and as a result cause you to speak in a different accent. My own immediate thought is, well, if I drive from, say, Norfolk, where we have a Norfolk accent, up to Newcastle, where we have a Geordie accent,
I don't then start talking in a Geordie accent. Maybe I'm missing something.
And that's it. We're out of time. Just remains for me to try and squeeze in one final story. Now, Monday the 11th of November, which has just gone, is Remembrance Day, or Poppy Day, in the UK and across most of the Commonwealth. So that includes Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and various states in the Caribbean. It's Veterans Day in the US. It's Polish Independence Day in Poland. And it's a national holiday in both France and Belgium, although the French use a blue cornflower known as the bluette rather than the red poppy. And all of them are celebrating the fact that on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was signed that ended World War I. However, it's also St. Martin's Day, or Martinmas, which is a far more ancient tradition, going back to the 4th century saint, generally known as St. Martin of Tours in France, where his shrine is. And he was a very popular saint during the Middle Ages, and indeed very popular in France too, not least when the armistice was declared on the same day as St. Martin's Day. Anyway, lots of legends and folklore associated with Martinmas. However, here's a peculiar one I found. It said, on Martinmas, you would turn into a donkey if you did not eat yellow jam on Ash Wednesday or 9 types of herb on Maundy Thursday. So basically, to avoid turning into no end of an ass, remember to eat toast and marmalade. That's it. It's Charles Christian here, and Janie as well, saying thank you very much for listening. Please tune in again same time next week, and until then, stay well, stay different. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.